सलाम, नमस्ते, सत श्री अकाल। जुगनूनामा में आपको एक नया जाविया पेश करेंगे, उर्दू, अंग्रेजी, पंजाबी तीनों ज़बानों में। लाइक और सब्सक्राइब करना मत भूलिएगा। Hello everyone, my guest today is Sam Dalrymple, historian, traveller, Desi at heart. We're talking today about his book, Shattered Lands, the 5 partitions that have made modern Asia. Sam, welcome. Let's go back to 1931 and what the British Raj looked like and what its dominions looked like at the time.
Sure, so I mean this is really, I think, the crux of the book, that we are so unfamiliar with the actual contours of what the Raj looked like. If you go back to 1931, the Raj did not consist of the kind of pre-partition map of India that we imagine, that India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. This was a colonial empire within an empire. Britain had 4 offices of state, the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and the Colonial Office, and a completely separate India Office, because this was a colony that included a quarter of the world's population. It stretched from the city of Aden in what's now Yemen and as far east as Rangoon and Burma. We often forget, I think, the fact that Burma and the Gulf states were included in Britain's Indian Empire. And I think it's important to understand that the Raj wasn't all governed in the same way. There was about 1/3 of it that was governed as princely states, these protectorates that were semi-independent. They had, like Jaipur, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, Kashmir, Bhavalpur, Kalat. These were semi-independent states that preserved their internal autonomy but had given up their foreign policy to the Raj. Now what's surprising to, I think, many people is if you look at the list of princely states that was officially printed by the British Indian government, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi and then goes on to list other states such as Bhutan and Nepal and Dubai.
And Qatar.
And Qatar.
And Kuwait.
So the story of this book essentially is how between 1931 and 1971, in the course of just 4 decades, 5 partitions tear this world apart into 12 independent nation states. You have Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. It's a much vaster story than I think we tend to realize, and one that I think explains so much about the world that we live in today. Everything from, obviously, the conflict over Kashmir and the nuclearization of the India-Pakistan conflict, but also conflicts in Balochistan, northeast India, civil war in Myanmar and Yemen, and even Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait all have their roots in these 5 partitions.
Let's go to 1937, when Burma is split off from the body of India. And this was the first of the partitions that you talk about. How did that influence events that came later?
So this, I think, is one of the least researched bits of kind of 20th century South Asian history, but hugely, hugely important. You can't understand the partition of India and the demand for Pakistan's creation without understanding the events of 1930s Burma. The very first document that invented the word Pakistan by Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, he coins the term Pakistan for a potential state for northwest Indian Muslims. And the justification that he uses for this state's creation is that I see no reason why if Burma is allowed to be separated, then we can't too. The very first declaration in favor of Pakistan uses Burma's separation as the precedent. Now this is it's a very interesting moment. Burma, although today a bit of an international pariah, was the kind of, Rangoon was the New York of its day. There were more people traveling across the Bay of Bengal in search of work in the 1920s than there were across the Atlantic Ocean in search of work in New York. And yet, there's so much immigration that, increasingly Burmese people themselves need to learn Bangla, Tamil or Urdu if they want to get work in Rangoon. And there's increasing demands for separation. And around the same time, there's an interesting change in the way that India's Congress leaders begin to talk about the Indian nation. They begin to argue, around the kind of 1920s, that perhaps, Indian nationalists shouldn't just be inheriting all of the regions that Britain conquered and now is governed as India. You have this increasing vocabulary that the nation that we want to form should bear the contours of Bharatvarsh, this sacred homeland as set out in the ancient Mahabharata epic, stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Sindh to Assam, but that doesn't include Burma and that doesn't include the Arabian states. And I don't think, if you don't take this into account, and the fact that this early partition chops off the Buddhist and Muslim majority sections of the Raj, it's impossible to understand why minorities starting in the late 1930s began to be so fearful about their future and potential domination by the vast Hindu majority. It's impossible to understand that without understanding that all of the minority regions had been cut off in 1937.
But Sam, let's go back to 1906 when Muhammad Ali Jinnah joins the Indian National Congress, and he doesn't move over to the League, to the Muslim League, until 1913. In fact, he goes on to forge even as the head of the Muslim League, he goes on to forge the Nehru-Jinnah Pact of 1916, and he remains committed to Hindu-Muslim unity. Starting with that kind of background, and as we know, Jinnah is a completely secular Muslim, how did things go so awry?
The transformation of Jinnah, I think, is one of the bits of the book that I found so fascinating. I think it was Patrick French who wrote that, Jinnah's become such an icon, and what he represents is so central to both India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, that it's very rare that we actually look at him as a human being and how he developed his ideas, and more specifically, how his ideas changed in the course of his political career. I think that as late as, the 1920s, Sarojini Naidu, probably the most prominent woman in the Congress
called
movement,
him the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity.
Exactly, and he drives around in fast cars smoking cigarettes and has this Parsi wife, and he's known as the best dressed man in Bombay. For him to transform into the founder of what became the world's first Islamic Republic, from the man who's known as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, he goes through a series of fascinating transformations. I think first and foremost is the fact that after marrying him, his wife, Ruti, is excommunicated by her Parsi community. And I think he begins to worry that maybe people can't move past these religious boundaries. Their marriage goes south very quickly. And all this new research has shown that she probably committed suicide after an unhappy marriage. And I think that this completely changed him as a man, and particularly the fact that whilst he was looking after her in hospital during a depressive episode, Nehru and Gandhi had used the opportunity to pass through a resolution basically overruling all of the political gains that he'd made. And he develops this very personal, deeply personal and painful animosity towards Congress's two main leaders. He in particular, I think, views Gandhi as this kind of, this diaspora guy who's come back from South Africa with all sorts of ideas about what Hinduism should be.
And as a born-again Hindu. And he says that Gandhi's use of Hindu imagery threatens to hijack the whole narrative and turn it into more religious than it is secular. So he fears that. But
he leaves the Congress eventually because he cannot stand the way that religion is being brought into politics. And of course this is a
huge irony, isn't it? And it's such a huge irony. But let's go further back into history. Let's go back, in fact, to 1857 and what we call the First War of Independence, and British historians have known as the Indian Mutiny. But following that, when the British decided that if they were to rule India, they couldn't deal with the whole mass of Indian people and their subjects as one. And so they had to divide them in order to rule them. So that's a kind of given now in both India and Pakistan and across the lands that were once part of the British Empire. But, it strikes me that the censuses that were carried out, in which Hindus slotted into one section, Muslims slotted into the other section, whereas in United India, I think that identities were much more fluid than emerged in the censuses, for instance. So that was one thing that set up the divisions that later then became so toxic. And after that, of course, separate electorates when Hindus could only vote for Hindus and Muslims only for Muslims. Then the partition of Bengal into Hindu majority Bengal and Muslim majority Bengal, and so many other things that the British did to consolidate the separate identities of its subjects. Don't you think those contributed eventually to the fissures that we saw in India?
I think absolutely, and I think particularly separate electorates, particularly the way that I think it was Alex von Tunzelmann talks about, by asking people to pick a box and choose a side in a sense, people had to brush over the complexity of their own identities. And I think this is very, very central into understanding what was happening. What I think is also important to recognise, though, and I think comes out particularly clear in the later years, is that British politics, much like politics today, is constantly shifting depending on basically whether there's a Conservative or Labour government. And it's fascinating how with each new viceroy, you essentially get a completely new political plan.
Sam, reading your book, I'm kind of struck by the casual racism of all the, not only the viceroys that you mentioned, but other politicians like the Labour leader, Clement Attlee, and others. Winston Churchill, of course, is the worst transgressor. He is a blatant racist.
Yeah.
But, that comes across very regularly. And obviously, their racism informed their policies. What do you say about that?
I mean, I was shocked by how even Clement Attlee, who's a anti-colonial Labour politician, when he arrives in India during the Simon Commission and he finally reaches Rangoon, which was, of course, the eastern provincial capital of India at the time, he writes very casually racist things like, the Burmans are jolly good chaps, but with an unfortunate propensity to murder. And these kind of sweeping statements of entire
And have we
community.
forgotten what Winston Churchill said when Gandhi first arrived to meet the viceroy? And he said, "And how dare this half-naked fakir," if I'm to quote him imagined in his tone, go and parley with the representative of the King Emperor. I mean, he was astounded and offended by that. Yeah. And how dare he behave like that?
He is one of the worst offenders, and of course, during the Bengal famine, which I think we'll get to later in this conversation, he writes, even when Wavell, etc., is trying to get aid to the Bengalis, Churchill writes these dismissive responses like, if the Bengalis are starving, then why isn't Gandhi dead yet?
Yes, quite right. And then, but none of this appears in British history, British colonial history. I don't see British textbooks reflecting any of this. I don't see people in mainland Britain even talking about the racism of a person like Churchill. I know Tariq Ali has done a lot of good seminal work on this, but in mainstream Britain, one doesn't see any of this at all.
There's an interesting shift. I mean, it's still appalling. There's an interesting shift, though, between, I'd say, 2018 and now. Just before Black Lives Matter, etc. When I started Project Dastan in 2018, there was not a single textbook that taught about partition. Now it's in every key stage 3 history textbook. You've got the beginnings. It's still one small aspect of it, but around the time of the 70th to 75th anniversaries of partition, the first inklings of it. But frankly, it's appalling that Britain, the most important thing that Britain ever did was conquer 1/4 of the world, and yet most Brits can go through their entire education system and not come across the British Empire.
And they can go around thinking that British history is only Henry VIII and Elizabeth I and blah, 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 and none of this. Yeah. And it's time to set that right. But let's also talk about some other racial stereotypes. For instance, the martial races. That's another one that has cost us so dearly and keeps costing us to this moment. I'd like you to reflect upon that.
I think that, for those who don't know, the martial races idea was invented basically in the wake of 1857, the Great Uprising, and was a way of Britain basically justifying through racial pseudoscience how to justify only recruiting basically kind of loyal communities who'd stayed with Britain in 1857 and not having to recruit those who had joined the rebels. And the way that they do it is they say that those who were loyal, such as Punjabis and Pathans, are considered martial races, and we're going to induct them more into the army. people like Bengalis and people from UP are not going to be inducted into the army. And of course,
because of course the revolt was led by people from the UP initially. Yeah, that's right. The Mangal Pandes and the Muslim soldiers of the Bengal regiment of the time.
Precisely.
Right.
And but you can see, I mean, I think to this day, this awful racial pseudoscience continues to be present whenever you hear an army uncle in either India or Pakistan talk about, oh, Sikhs are a martial race, or kind of Punjabis are a martial race. Most brutally, it was used during 1971 by the Pakistani army to justify atrocities against Bengalis, and by saying kind of, oh, you know, we're more martial than them. And then similar attacks on Urdu speakers on the basis that we are proving that we are a martial race. And so the way that this British colonial pseudoscience about kind of, you know, racial hierarchies continues to
cause such harm.
And today it's amazing how many Sikh friends that I have who continue to internalize this idea that Sikhs and Punjabis are a martial race, and it's somehow been brought into the kind of religious canon almost, that Sikhs are a martial race, despite the fact that this is a entirely random racial pseudoscience invented by Britain in the 19th century, with nothing to do with early Sikh ideas of the self.
Your book is full of lovely, personal, grainy detail, and that's what makes it unputdownable for me. I enjoyed so much kind of exploring the characters who determined our histories. One thing as a woman that struck me was that all these three leaders who led the independence of India, Mahatma Gandhi, Pandit Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, all three of them had miserable marriages. In the case of Nehru, Motilal, his father, was a very domineering father figure, you know, a kind of, and he insisted that he marry within the caste of Kashmiri Pandits, and married Kamala, who later became, but she was tubercular and she was miserable, and he didn't have time for her, and they didn't have much in common, and finally she wasted away and died in early death. Similarly with Rati Jinnah, you just mentioned her. She was cast away by her family, and then Jinnah felt that slight very, very acutely, especially because Sir Dinshaw Pettit, her father, was his best friend, right? And of course, from his point of view,
although they never spoke again after
Rati ran away with him. But, and you can, I mean, I can understand it from Sir Dinshaw's point of view, but also from Jinnah's point of view. But then he never had time for his young wife.
He's too busy fighting the freedom movement.
And then, but she writes in her letters that he was a neglectful husband as well, and she so committed suicide at the age of 29. And his daughter, Dina,
on her 29th birthday.
She died on her 29th birthday. She committed suicide on her 29th birthday. How sad is that, Sam? And their one child was not named for years, and then she ended up naming herself Dina. In the case of Mahatma Gandhi, his wife Kasturba fell very ill. And when his son insisted that she would recover if given a dose of penicillin, Gandhi objected and said, no way, she's not getting penicillin, we will rely on Paramatma, we will rely on traditional medicine, etc. And Kasturba dies. And then Gandhi kind of dissolves into fits of tears, etc., and secludes himself for some time. What is it with these men?
I think Rati Jinnah, I think has one of the most tragic stories of all, and her suicide letter kind of reduced me to tears the first time I read it. She writes this incredibly heartfelt thing, which I'm going to paraphrase, but is along the lines of, you know, try to remember me as the flower that you plucked and not the flower that you trampled on. I have loved you, my darling, and had you loved me a little more, I would have stayed with you.
And had I loved you any less, I would have still survived. And Sheila Reddy's written this wonderful book.
Brilliant book. Recommended to all listeners here.
Recommended to all listeners here, yeah. And it is really so sad.
Heart-wrenching.
Heart-wrenching, heart-wrenching. Mr. Nehru, of course, is very keen on Padmaja Naidu at some stage, as you say in your book, writing letters to her, calling her Carissima, etc. This is, of course, before Edwina Mountbatten arrives on the scene. You write also about other people in the partition and their personal kind of testimonies, which again, like the Rati letter reduced you to tears, for me, Fikr Tonsfi's words reduced me to tears, really. Sam, he's a man who comes from Tonsa Sharif, which is in South Punjab. He's a Hindu, but styles himself in the Urdu tradition of Fikr Tonsfi, right? The thinking Tonsfi. And he has so many Muslim friends, Mumtaz and others, with whom he's like a brother. And the travails that he goes through during the partition, when he's rent asunder, really, that was very interesting to me. And then Saadat Hasan Manto's testimony was very interesting to me. Even the poor Nawab of Junagadh. Now, I know that with your background with the Dastan project, you are also an oral historian.
Yeah.
So how did you collect all these oral testimonies?
So this was the background of the book. It began when I was in my last year of college, actually, when I was having some conversations with both my Indian and Pakistani friends, about how tragic it was that we couldn't sit and have these conversations back in the subcontinent where Indians struggle to get to Pakistan.
And when we're abroad, we're always each other's best friends.
And this is not the case with any other major conflict zone. You don't get Russians and Ukrainians
or
being best
Israelis
friends.
and Palestinians.
Precisely.
No, never.
So I think we were all chatting and about the fact that Sparsh, my friend from Delhi, who's now in Australia, he was desperate to see his ancestral hometown and show it to his grandfather, who always dreamed of going back and never could.
This is in Jhang.
This is, precisely, just south of Jhang, a small town called Bela, just on the Punjab KPK border. And so we came up with this idea of using virtual reality to try and reconnect families across the border and show people their old house, their old haveli, their old mosque, mandir, gurdwara, school, whatever it might be. One person wanted to see the place where they went on the first date with their husband before they moved to Karachi. And trying to track down these stories, I think it went viral on Instagram, and suddenly all these people began reaching out to try and record their oral histories. We began traveling across India, Punjab, UP, Hyderabad, to Peshawar, to Dhaka, Kolkata. And more, I think, as this project blew up, more and more people offered up their stories. And so we ended up, I think, this book uses interviews in, I think, 8 different languages, many of which I collected with Project Dastan. And I think there's this urgency right now to try and collect these memories, just as there was a few years ago with World War II veterans or Holocaust survivors. I think that the generation who remembered partition is now either getting too old and their kind of memories fading, or they were too young when we still have many people who were alive at partition, but sometimes they were just 5 years old. And the people who were 20 years old at partition are now 98. And so we're losing the generation who were compos mentis enough to kind of really have strong memories of what was going on. And so there's never been a more important time, I think, both in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and in particularly in the UK and the States. There are all sorts of archives that have been begun in the last decade. Shout out to the 1947 Partition Archive in Berkeley, which has done incredible oral history research, to the point that now, if I, as a scholar, wanted to listen to some accounts of partition from Hyderabad, I could have 120 interviews by logging onto their archive, and could choose between kind of Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, Jewish testimonies.
Tell me about this. Where do you log on to this?
So currently they're based in Berkeley, and I was lucky enough to work with them and got access to it. But they are just basically starting up a new service now where universities across the world will be able to get a subscription and have it completely available online, all these thousands of interviews, available to all university students. And then for other researchers, you either have to work with them or pay. But it's an incredible resource. And they're just really beginning to get the traction now. I think that they've been working at this for kind of 10 years now, but the website's now live and all the rest of it. So well worth looking onto 1947 Partition Archive.
In 1939, the Second World War breaks out, Sam. Now we know that resources are diverted to the war. We know that the Bengal famine happens as a result of those diverted resources. We know that many Indians are mobilized and millions of Indian soldiers go and fight in the war effort. Tell me how that accelerates Indian independence and what effect the Second World War has on the British Empire.
I think the World War II is one of the most important pieces of the puzzle to understanding what happens at partition. And yet, because of the fact that these soldiers are fighting for the British Empire, it's one that all of the post-colonial nations of South Asia have been kind of quite keen to brush over. But the fact is that the Indian Army's mobilization in World War II was the largest mobilization in history. I think kind of, in the millions of of volunteers, the largest volunteer force in history. Of course, under colonial duress and etc. But this completely changes the map of South Asia. Everyone is brought into the war effort in ways that we've completely forgotten. The gem cutters of Jaipur, for example, are suddenly hired to make the first sniper scopes in South Asia. You get the last use of war elephants in history as elephants are turned to logging on the frontier to help build defences. And in the process, I think you get the militarization of society that sets the basis for what happens in partition. You can't understand the bloodshed that occurs in 1947, specifically in Punjab, without understanding that Punjab was the centre of the military
and
that in the
wake armament of the martial races and so many arms left over floating about and so many trained men out there in the field.
Precisely. It's impossible to understand what happens in the Punjab without understanding that there was the largest demobilization in history and that suddenly the state was awash with weapons on a black market and with men who knew how to use them. So I think it's immensely important, and also the fact that you've got so Congress protests the war effort. The Quit India movement is launched and the Congress is arrested for virtually the entirety of the war.
And the Muslim League supports it.
And the Muslim League supports it and rises up in Britain's estimations, so that by the end of World War II, the Muslim League for the very first time is on par with the Congress in terms of popular support. And that wouldn't have happened had the Congress not been arrested and basically absent from the political scenario for 3 years.
So nature abhors a vacuum and the Muslim League came into the vacuum. Let's talk about the Bengal famine of 1943. 2 to 3 million people starved to death during the Bengal famine. The British do nothing about it until the very end.
The greatest tragedy of the war, and it's incredible. The statistics are extraordinary. And Kavita Puri's amazing new podcast, 3 Million, everyone should listen to. It's ironic that the year of World War II that actually had the least fighting would see the most civilian casualties in the British Empire. So it's the key to understanding it is basically the after effects of Burma's partition with India are still there. But Bengal had been reliant on Burmese rice coming in. And when Japan basically conquers Burma, Bengal is cut off from much of its rice supply. But it still has enough. And then there's a cyclone that hits. And things begin to go awry. But the key thing that changes is that you've got all these troops coming in from abroad, basically skyrocketing the inflation across Bengal. And it's not that there wasn't enough rice in the state. There just about was. There was much less than usual, but there still was enough rice. But the key, as Amartya Sen has shown in his work, was that thanks to all this inflation, people were unable to afford the rice. And this is crucial. There was enough rice. But Britain refuses to open up food kitchens, being convinced basically that there was enough rice. And Linlithgow and Wavell both write letters to Churchill basically saying, stop diverting the rice, we need to open soup kitchens, etc. And interestingly, they do open soup kitchens in Tamil Nadu, which was also reliant on Burmese rice beforehand. And there, no one starves. But in Bengal, they don't. And Churchill writes back, if the Bengalis are starving, why isn't Gandhi dead yet? And of course, in the next 3 years, 3 million civilians will die. There will be more civilian casualties from the British Empire during the year of the least fighting.
Isn't that shocking? Absolutely.
And I think one of the other interesting new revelations that have come out about partition recently by Janam Mukherjee's amazing work, Hungry Bengal, is that the first fighting that is recorded on Direct Action Day, the first partition riot, was actually, the first bit of violence was hungry Bengalis 3 years later trying to break into a food bank. And so it wasn't the first gunshots on that famous day that would lead to the spiraling religious violence across the subcontinent.
That wasn't a communal cause in the first place.
The first shots were hungry Bengalis breaking into a food bank.
Not a communal cause by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, Sam, in 1946, there's a moment of hope with the Cabinet Mission Plan that arrives and proposes a loose federation with autonomous Muslim areas and Hindu areas and others. And interestingly, Mr. Jinnah accepted, but Pandit Nehru and Gandhi rejected. Do you think it was bound to fail?
I don't. I think, so this is everyone I know who's worked on partition. The cabinet mission plan kind of sits there in your mind as the greatest what if. Jinnah, by this point, has been basing his career for the last 6 years on the establishment of a separate Muslim homeland. And yet, when this plan is put forward, the idea was that you'd have a UK-style system. So just as the UK is made up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so there would be a federal system where there's North India, South India, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and a Deccan. And there would be 5 nations within one nation state. And Jinnah, whose fight for Pakistan seems to be based around constitutional guarantees for Muslim security, accepts this plan. And the Congress pulls out last minute because of the fact that the Northwest Frontier was then ruled by a Congress government, and they wanted the Northwest Frontier to be part of the North India nation rather than the West Pakistan nation.
Which was physically impossible, of course. And
this, for Jinnah, who's just, basically given as much as he can, sees this as the greatest betrayal and pulls out of the negotiations. And he says, if you're pulling out of this, we will either have a divided India or a destroyed India. And he then organizes direct action.
Direct action. And that has disastrous consequences in Bengal to begin with, and then later in Rawalpindi and so forth. But the lead up to partition is kind of laced with tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy, some of which could have been avoided. For instance, Lord Wavell, the penultimate Viceroy of India, was a man of tremendous integrity, was a man of enormous sympathy for everybody who lived in the subcontinent, and he famously recommended that the British should not pull out of India in unseemly haste and do it properly and over a period of time. Now, Wavell, sort of Whitehall loses patience with Wavell and he's withdrawn. And you get the brash Lord Mountbatten to replace him, who arrives and he just doesn't have the bandwidth. I can just imagine him saying, oh, I've got such a headache with these people. He doesn't have the bandwidth to do it slowly and patiently. And he wants to out as soon as possible. Yeah. Wasn't that another tragedy?
Precisely, I think so. I think that Wavell was far more even-handed in his dealings with everyone, whereas Mountbatten clearly, gets on famously well with Nehru and cannot stand Jinnah. And in some sense, I think the most consequential event in Mountbatten's viceroyalty was the fact that he had been given by Prime Minister Attlee. He'd been given a year and a half. He'd given until June 1948 to pull out of India. He's given basically a year and a half. And he decides to speed it up to 77 days, do partition 2 countries in 77 days. And he does so for a very simple reason. He describes it later. His aim is to shock everyone into getting moving because he found that they were all being too slow. And why did he choose 14th, 15th August 1947 as Independence Day? Because it was the 2nd anniversary of the Japanese surrender and would make a nice round whole number.
Goodness.
And that's why India and Pakistan have the Independence Day that they do.
It's another shocking thing to me that that they should think so cavalierly about the fate of millions and millions of people. Sam, we have long been taught that neighbor turned on neighbor, community turned on community. People who had lived in relative peace for a millennia at least together suddenly became bloodthirsty. But your book shows that that's not necessarily the truth, and that partition violence was organized and led by gangs from the RSS, the Muslim League National Guards, and Qabza groups, people who were just hungry for property and takeovers. So, that to me is a revelation which also contains a bit of hope, because after all, the communities who still tend to have sympathy for each other and across borders, especially in the Punjab, this kind of bears out the truth that you speak about. Tell us about that.
In my time doing oral histories, you certainly find huge numbers of horrors and sometimes you find horrors that people themselves remember doing. far more common.
And then dying of remorse after that.
And dying of remorse.
Yeah.
But far more common are stories of people sheltering their neighbours from mobs. And one of the most frequent things that I heard is we don't know where the mob came from because they weren't from here.
That's it.
And there's been a lot of new research recently on the rise of paramilitary groups in the 1930s and the leading role they played in the violence of 1947. It's not just these paramilitary groups as well, it's also local politicians who are trying to ethnically cleanse their district so as to win the next election. These incredibly kind of horrible figures who, I mean, in the politics of the subcontinent today, we can completely imagine. And you have the, very clearly, Noor Khali, which is the second major moment of partition
Racial
violence,
riot,
and
yeah.
then in Bihar, which is the third, before it then spreads nationwide. The second and the third key moments of violence, one is directed against Hindus, one is directed against Muslims, are both led by local politicians taking revenge against their political rivals and taking revenge against the neighbourhoods who voted for their political rivals in the recent elections. And it was land grabbing, and it was this very zero-sum politics and the way that local politics was tied in with local gundas that led to this far more than individual neighbours turning on one another. That almost nowhere I have actually found evidence of a neighbour turning on neighbour. You do find horrific moments, of course, and there is one particularly scary moment when during the violence in Kolkata in Direct Action Day. There's a Hindu student who's staying with his Muslim friends, and while staying there, while sheltered by the Muslim friends one day go out into the streets and kill a Hindu passerby. And he asks why they're saving him if they're killing other Hindus, and they say, we know you, so it's different. So of course you do have this very blatant religious animosity seething at this point, but far more common is people trying to protect each other.
Sam, 17 to 20 million people crossed the Radcliffe line. Radcliffe, of course, being that lawyer from Hampstead in London who had never been to the subcontinent before and who came here in a matter of days and chopped it all up, and off he went back to Hampstead. Millions of people are killed. 100,000 women are abducted and raped. Women are the silent victims of these tragedies. Women are not part of the decision making. They're not part of any of the perpetration of the violence, and yet they are the prime victims of this through themselves, on their own persons, or their children, or their husbands, or their homes. And I don't think enough is said about the women who were the victims of the partition. What do you think about that?
I agree, and it's actually a lot of the best work on partition has been made by women who are interviewing about these horrors, and I think there's a line by Yasmin Saikia on the violence of 1971, which was like, don't ask me which religion the perpetrator came from or the ethnicity of the perpetrators were men. And I think that that says it all.
Let's talk about Kashmir, that festering sore that haunts both India and Pakistan to this day, and the poor Kashmiris who are right in the middle of it. Do you think it could have been different? Because your book speaks about how the Lashkars were mobilized to go into Kashmir following killings in Kashmir, following the Maharaja's kind of undecidedness about whether he should accede to India or Pakistan, and the pressure on the Maharaja. And then crucially, the cutting off of Gurdaspur district, which was contiguous with Pakistani territory, 60% Muslim, and yet delivered to India. Because without Gurdaspur, India would not have had an entry into Kashmir. Tell us about that.
So I think we often imagine that the way that the task that Radcliffe was given when drawing the Radcliffe line was dividing districts by simple Hindu-Muslim majorities. In fact, he was given the task also to basically allow for viable states, take into account water tables, and take into account access to other areas. So, for example, whilst both countries were required as part of his brief to have access to Kashmir, there was one road that had to come in from Pakistan, one road that comes to India. So Gurdaspur, despite being majority Muslim, ends up with India. Likewise, you actually get the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which were 1% Muslim, given to East Pakistan, because, and despite the fact that they were 99% Buddhist and animist, were given to Pakistan so that Chittagong, the biggest port that's now in Bangladesh, would have a hinterland and wouldn't just kind of be backed onto Indian territory. And so, likewise, Murshidabad, with a Muslim majority now in one of the historic centres of Muslim culture in Bengal, is given to India. And time and time again you see this. The story of the princely states I call the fourth partition in my book, because we often think that Radcliffe drew the entire line, but in fact 81% of the India-Pakistan border was determined by princes.
Acceding to one or the other.
Acceding to one or the other. Whereas almost 100% of the India-Bangladesh border, East Pakistan's border, you can call the Radcliffe line. Remarkably, only the segment between basically kind of Sri Ganganagar and Gurdaspur, that section of the western border was drawn by Radcliffe and nothing else. Kashmir wanted to follow suit from Bhutan and Nepal, which, let's not forget, were also princely states, and passed a legal case to have their independence recognized because they were Himalayan states bordered in more than on 3 sides by non-Indian territory and historically linked with Tibet rather than the plains. Nepal and Bhutan passed this resolution saying that Himalayan states should be allowed to remain independent. And what's fascinating is the Maharaja of Kashmir originally had planned to follow suit from Nepal and Bhutan and also remain entirely independent.
Yes, but Mr. Nehru was from Kashmir and he wanted desperately for Kashmir to be part of India. So he was asked, according to your book, don't you want Kashmir? And he said, yes, I do want Kashmir to be part of India. But we hear that the Pakistani tribal Lashkars who were sent into Kashmir to forcibly change the status quo were sent in as an answer to an act of provocation. What do you say about that? What provoked that?
So what seems to have happened, so both Nehru and Jinnah early on don't make, I think there's this kind of myth that both of them are after Kashmir early on. Early on it seems that both of the leaders are kind of willing to let Kashmir go. They're trying to ask the Maharaja to join their countries. They're doing all sorts of politics, but they're not forcing anything. What seems to change is that there's a partition mob crosses from Punjab into Jammu. And it's mutual ethnic cleansing, but in particular, the Muslims of Jammu are murdered. And this convinces several Pakistani generals to go behind Jinnah's back and sponsor a Lashkar to enter Kashmir and get it to join Pakistan.
So Jinnah didn't know about it?
Jinnah had no idea, and this is the first, but not the last time, that members of the Pakistani military will go behind the back of civilian authority.
Don't we know about all about
that? Sponsor cross-border sort of attacks. And I think that this is the moment that forces the Maharaja of Kashmir's hand. Seeing basically this Lashkar enter is the moment that he actually decides to accede to India. And of course, very quickly after this fact, you have the Indian and Pakistani armies pulled into Kashmir, so that by the end of the year, you have troops who, let's not forget, were fighting alongside one another, defending their lives in World War II, risking their lives for one another as brothers, suddenly fighting against each other on the front lines, on the plateau of the world.
And let's not forget that the Lashkars stop in Baramulla, exactly 1 hour out of Srinagar, to loot and pillage. And they're merrily doing that, whereas they could have gone on to Srinagar and altered the status quo forever. But they don't do that. And then the militaries get involved. And then Pakistan's British Commander-in-Chief, General Gracie, refuses to follow Jinnah's orders and says, I will not engage. And that's not the first time that Pakistani generals have refused to follow their leaders' orders.
Exactly. So there's all sorts of fascinating new documents that I think have also been released on this, and I think this is something we should also talk about. I think that so much has been written about Kashmir and the origins of the conflict, but in recent years, what's so fascinating is the way that a host of new secret intelligence documents by all of the major countries involved have been released to the public and often been sitting in these archives, but without scholars looking at them. And I think that there's a few books recently that have really begun, since 2018, really begun to change a lot of the received narratives that we've had for the last 70 years, based off of these declassified new pieces of information. I think one of the most surprising pieces is the fact that in the wake of the ceasefire in Kashmir and the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, Indian and Pakistani secret intelligence begin information sharing for almost a decade.
Your book shows that Mountbatten is very perturbed at what's happening in Kashmir, and he offers Mr. Jinnah a plebiscite in Kashmir, provided the Lashkars are withdrawn quickly, and then Kashmir's accession to Pakistan on the condition of Hyderabad's accession to India.
Yeah.
And Mr. Jinnah refuses to take that.
Mr. Jinnah refuses. And this whole story is full of so many what-ifs and moments that somehow in the public consciousness have been completely forgotten.
And after this tragedy of Kashmir, we come to 1950 and the Liaquat-Nehru Pact, which again is a very hopeful milestone in Indo-Pak relations, followed by 11 years of peace and cooperation. And it doesn't end until India invades Goa and conquers it. And then Ayub Khan, who's the first martial law dictator in Pakistan, just goes up the wall. What happened then?
This is one of the most important new revelations that's come out with the declassification of basically intelligence files that's been released in the last 10, 15 years and has only really been discovered by scholars since COVID. And there's two in particular, Avinash Paliwal is one, and Pallavi Raghavan. And they both found this extraordinary series of documents that proved that India and Pakistan begins working together. You've got the Indus Water Treaty, of course, but you also have the resolution of all sorts of border issues, and most importantly, Indian and Pakistani intelligence officers working with each other and sharing intelligence to stop the rise of communism in their respective countries. So there's a particular moment in early, I think it's 1951, but I may be wrong there, when they begin working together to back anti-communist forces in Rangoon.
Because they saw communism as the bigger foe at the time.
China turning communist, in the late 1940s, creates a complete switch. And suddenly, as a result, there's a complete thaw in relations that I think we've by and large forgotten. But it's as a result of this thaw that Muhammad Ali Jinnah's tomb in Karachi is built by an Indian Muslim from Bombay. You have Zulfikar Ali Bhutto able to retain his Indian citizenship and resolve his property laws until the mid-1950s. So he doesn't become a Pakistani citizen
until 1955, I think.
And there's time and time again you have joint Indo-Pakistani passports that I think if you go to the Museum of National History in Lahore, you've got some of these passports and they are fascinating. They say, India's/Pakistan, and that was a possibility to have these kind of joint documents showing, ties across these borders that stays there until 1961. And this is when India decides to, what they call the liberation of Goa, basically kicking out the Portuguese, who India continues to consider, European colonists that stayed on in South Asia and need to be kicked out. But Ayub Khan, sitting here in Pakistan, considers this a scary moment and begins to worry that India has newly expansionist tendencies. And so in order to kind of back this up and look after his options, he, for the first time in 1961, extends support to Naga rebels in northeastern India. He had the opportunity to do so 3 years earlier and turned it down because he was actually working with India. But in 1961, it all goes south, and within 2 years of this, you get Indian intelligence's first communications with separatist groups in both East Pakistan as well as the Northwest Frontier Province. What's interesting is that at this late stage, Kashmir and Balochistan don't have anything to do with cross-border funding. It's actually early on more in East Pakistan and Nagaland, India's northeast, and that is where the early subterfuge happens. But by 1964, just 4 years later, everything has collapsed. The whole cooperation pacts have collapsed, so that by 1965 you've got the Second Indo-Pak War, and from that, partition survivors are no longer able to cross the border and visit old family members. The idea of having cross-border property is revoked, so the enemy property acts are passed on both sides. And I think that 1965 and then of course later 1971 are in a sense kind of, you know, these second moments of partition, the moments when the ruptures of 1947, which had been healing, are reopened, and they've remained festering wounds ever since.
Well, Sam, all of this shows that when geopolitics changes, things in the Indian subcontinent also follow suit and also change, with tremendous possibilities for peace at the time. And as we know, things are topsy-turvy these days in the world, and geopolitics is changing very fast. So on that note, can we hope that things will change for the better in the Indian subcontinent as well?
I, despite my better judgment, am still very hopeful. I mean, we mentioned this earlier in the discussion, but there is no other war zone where people have been firing missiles across a border this year, where it's still possible, where every Indian and Pakistani that meet abroad will become best friends, they will have eat the same food, listen to the same music, often date one another. And you know, their conversation will sour when Kashmir is brought up, but by and large there is still this kind of person-to-person ability to just get along immediately that is not there amongst Ukrainians and Russians, amongst Israelis and Palestinians. And no other war zone is full of people who so more want to be friends, I think. And so despite the tireless attempts by politicians to pull these countries apart, I think it's inevitable that at some point this border will be lesser. You know, I don't see a moment where you know, of where the borders disappear and we're reunited into a kind of greater South Asia. But I do see at some point something has to give.
Something has to give. Hope springs eternal, and who knows, all those old dreams that Mr. Jinnah had of cooperation in the subcontinent, and that other leaders had too. Pandit Nehru had them, and certainly Mahatma Gandhi also had them. We don't know, they might yet come true. Thank you very much, Sam.
Thanks for having me.